Is the head of the Wagner group changing his tune? Is it because he's out of people in Bakhmut? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It is March 24th, 2023. This is your daily Ukraine update. Let's get into it. Okay, first let's take a look at the control map. Biggest news is actually that there's not really any news. So you guys can see, update as of yesterday, not any reported changes to the Bakhmut front line or the Avdiivka front lines. Both areas are probably, it's fair to say, the Russian aligned forces' main two axes of effort as they try to encircle the cities and cut off their supply lines. But both of these, while they are the closest we've seen to Russian success, they are not in and of themselves successful Russian operations. And this is important because in contrast, right, you might remember the Battle of Severodonetsk or Lysychansk, and these were fairly decisive Russian victories in which they did execute a pretty bold encirclement and forced Ukrainian withdrawal. When we go over to the combat map, you guys can see that most notably, first off, the attacks are fairly light in volume, literally none reported in Bakhmut, instead focusing almost entirely on building out these two prongs, which it seems Russia thinks they're more likely to literally encircle Bakhmut and Chasiv Yar than they are to actually complete their encirclement of Bakhmut, which is itself kind of wild, that they even assess that that's easier than just cutting off the highways that are, it looks like 3 or 4 meters from the front lines. But in Avdiivka, you can see the same thing is playing out. Avdiivka itself, they're just choosing simply not to battle there, instead going around these cities. This is a little bit of a playbook from like medieval siege warfare, in which fighting in cities was simply seen as, in many cases, a waste of time. You would besiege the cities, but you wouldn't actually clear them. You would just sort of try to encircle them and get out the defenders, starve them out before the military doing the sieging ran out of supplies first. A pretty strange dynamic that was not, in medieval warfare certainly, was not seen as being very effective. That's why you literally had 100-year-long wars. So this encircle and wait strategy, it's playing out about like it did then, right? Very slow, very plodding, very difficult to achieve those effects. I don't think they're like 100 years from taking Bakhmut, but literally at this pace, if their goal was to take all of Ukraine at this rate, it would probably take them like 100 years. What's also interesting, of course, when we go over to the Russian Ministry of Defense. Oh, wait. One other thing I want to point out. Only 79 Russian attacks. This is definitely on the low end of operational pace. And we're seeing Russians slow their pace of operations and concentrate their forces, their attacks, almost exclusively in areas where they probably feel that they can achieve actual battlefield effects, which, again, is probably more a sign of desperation by Russia than it is an indication that Russia is learning lessons. But the initiative is still in their favor. What the other half of the equation that we're waiting on is Ukrainian counterattacks. It's been a while, and Russia, as they slow, remember, they're continually bringing in men and material, right? There's a burn rate and there's kind of a recharge rate. And if the burn rate slows and the recharge rate doesn't, with more men, more material, then the Russian forces are going to get stronger and more able to defend. So again, decisive action at the right time is essential. And actually, if you guys have been on my site, combatvetnews.com, right? You may know I got booted off Patreon. I guess they decided the Ukraine conflict is not something they want to be a part of. So I launched my own site, combatvetnews.com. And it has all my existing YouTube videos, but more importantly, it's got members-only content. It's actually slightly less. I'm not logged in on this browser. Like, are you logged into your own site? It is slightly cheaper than Patreon, but it has all the old Patreon content. Here we go. And what we looked at yesterday is this Russian mechanized infantry clearing trenches, and we saw, and look at that thumbnail. We saw that the power of decisive engagement, right? The Ukrainian forces in that video really were able to come up with a plan, even though it was imperfect, even though its execution was a little shaky, because they had a plan. Wasn't that complicated, but they executed it decisively. They were able to push these Russian forces right out of this trench. And that is, I think, scalable in concept, where you don't have to have the complete force, the perfect plan, every single supply bullet pre-positioned and loaded. You need to have a good plan and you need to execute it hard. So, of course, if you want to support that, I always have the link to my site in the description. But here's the other weird thing, right? One, we're seeing Russia has actually outsourced training many of its newly mobilized troops to Belarus. And even though the Belarusian military is more poorly trained, certainly, than the best Russian troops, the fact that it's using this Belarusian army is an indicator that even the basic military training apparatus of the Russian state have been co-opted and sent to this conflict, and that they're relying on a fairly, we'll say, developing world military to provide the basic sort of combat training these newly mobilized Russian forces require, which itself is a sign, again, of sort of Russia's problems. Now, here's where things get really interesting. Prigozhin seems to have softened his rhetoric towards the Russian MOD, probably because he's lost a huge portion of his mercenary force in Bakhmut. And he's losing them to, obviously, combat itself. He's also losing them to their 6-month contracts starting to expire. And he's losing them to simply his pipeline has been cut off. He's no longer allowed to recruit inmates from Russian prisons, which was one of his best source of low-training, low-skill troops. So he probably realizes that he needs to start making some friends and not be quite so combative with everyone. So what he has said is, first off, he's claimed that 200,000 Ukrainian reserves are concentrating in an effort to attack along the entire eastern front line. And that's almost certainly not the case. And into Russia proper, which we know is definitely not the case, and even into Bakhmut, which I guess I hadn't really considered that as a possibility, though it seems utterly preposterous that Ukrainian forces will actually try to punch into Russian forces where they're most concentrated. Seems kind of weird to me, but again, one thing I'll say, I wouldn't expect it. It would be an unexpected move. Prigozhin also claims that the Ukrainians have 80,000 troops in Bakhmut, Sloviansk, and surrounding areas in an effort to prepare to counterattack Bakhmut. But even Igor Girkin is kind of doubting him. But he's exaggerating this imminent threat, probably to get more supplies and reinforcements from the Russian MOD to relieve the pressure on Wagner forces in Bakhmut. Right, he acknowledged for the first time that MOD forces are fighting alongside Chechen units in Bilohorivka and Luhansk Oblast, and he surprisingly promoted MOD volunteer recruitment efforts and Wagner efforts to recruit in the same statement. Pretty wild for someone who thinks the MOD, at least even a couple weeks ago, was impossibly crooked and frighteningly incompetent. Big change of narrative. His criticism has gotten more general towards the Russian military bureaucracy, particularly the defense industrial base, but that's, of course, what the Kremlin wants him to say. So this is a far cry from the counterculture, speak truth to power, no filter Prigozhin image that he's been trying to cultivate. This is a huge 180. Here's what's weird, though. He still is sort of off message, because he also said Russia's fighting exclusively with Ukrainians who are equipped with NATO-provided equipment and some Russia-phobic mercenaries who voluntarily support Ukraine, but not NATO itself. This is not the narrative of the Russian state. This is an accurate description of the war, as far as I can tell. I mean, obviously, I don't know if they're like Russophobic or whatever, but like, I'm sure if you're fighting for Ukraine, I'm sure you're not a Russian. I'm sure you're not a big fan of Russia. So you probably this is a weird level of truth to power. Yeah, he goes and also says Russian officials knew NATO would offer military aid to Ukraine because it's ridiculous to think that when Russia decided to conduct this special military operation, it did not account for NATO's help to Ukraine. Also true, especially given that we know Russia worked pretty hard to influence U.S. politicians to turn against Ukraine in many ways, or to fail to support Ukraine. He's unsure about the objective of defascistification. I'm trying to come up with a non-demonetized word for this. I'm sorry, guys. And he does not know if there are fascists in Ukraine. He also noted Russia, that the other Russian talking point of demilitarizing Ukraine will only happen if the Ukrainian military is destroyed, but it's unclear if that'll ever be successful. This is some truth bombs. This is so weird that in one breath he is aligning with Kremlin talking points, and in the next breath he is throwing what seems to be the best and most accurate assessment, totally flying in the face of a lot of the Kremlin propaganda. Right? He said Russia can avoid an exhausting war by deciding now which borders it wants to capture. And he called on the Russian media to stop underestimating Ukrainian forces and engaging in internal conflicts. This is pretty wild. And I wonder if Prigozhin is serving as an unofficial mouthpiece where Putin cannot say these things, where he sees the reality for what it is. He's not a maniac. He understands that they need to avoid this protracted war and reach some sort of consensus on what borders it wants to hold. And Putin and the Kremlin establishment can't say these things. But we know maybe Putin's signaling, hey, Prigozhin is inside the house, right? We've brought him into the tent. He's saying basically the correct things. And now we are going to signal unofficially that we understand some realities about this conflict, and that maybe this is a prerequisite to saying, hey, we're willing to negotiate. We agree this can't go on forever. Maybe Xi sat Putin down and was like, listen, you need to find a solution to this conflict because we, the Chinese, are not going to back you in it. And what we want to see is us negotiate a peace deal. And we will make it worth Russia's while to negotiate this deal. But you have to come to the table with things that sound realistic. And so, Putin can't 180, but Prigozhin maybe can. That's my thesis on this. Anyway, guys, let me know what your thoughts are. That's all I had for today. Thank you, guys. As always, you can see I'm on the road. I had some technical issues. That's why we're a little late. But this has been really interesting. And I will see you guys in the next one. Cheers.